Western Arts Center.
All right, great. We have everybody. We'll have people kind of gathering in. I've been told to stay on schedule. And so, welcome back. I'm Laura Herman, as you know. And we are talking about building out a nuclear ecosystem this afternoon after our break here. And I just wanted to set this up a little bit. I told all of our panelists that they kind of introduce themselves, but I do want to take a moment because I think, we've talked a lot about the excitement and the enthusiasm in the industry right now, all of the great opportunities, and I don't want to go without saying, the devil's always in the details. And so there are challenges ahead, and we recognize that building out that nuclear ecosystem is an important thing. And when we talk about what that means, we're talking about safety concerns and cost, the need, really helping people recognize the benefits of nuclear energy in each and everyone's own context. And so this panel, we have folks that are really looking at those issues full time. And so when you think about all of the community leaders who are working on energy issues and water issues and school board issues, it can be really overwhelming, the number and the diversity of topics that elected officials have to work on. So here we have 4 people who are looking at the details of what nuclear deployment really means and how we're going to do it full time. So I think it's a great set of resources that we have here. We have Steve Camello, who is with the Energy Foundations Institute. Did I get that right?
Energy
Futures Initiative. Sorry, too many acronyms today.
Too many TLAs, 3-letter acronyms.
Yes, too many acronyms. So EFI Foundation is how I know it. And but before Steve joined EFI, he was actually at Stanford's Graduate School of Business as faculty. So he's kind of bringing that business perspective. And when they launched EFI Foundation with the Clean Air Task Force, launched the Nuclear Scaling Initiative, it's really designed for this conversation that we're having here today and trying to address some of those issues on how do we overcome the challenges to deployment. We have, next to Steve, we have Alan Ahn, who is the Deputy Director for Nuclear at Third Way, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. that was one of the first organizations in Washington to start looking at the potential for new nuclear. About, 12 years ago or so, they started to recognize the private investment going into some of the startup companies and started to map the new interest in nuclear, and wow, have we come a long way since those initial maps. So it's great to have Alan here. We also have Ross Matsken-Bridger from the Nuclear Threat Initiative. My notes are wrong. So Ross is here from the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And what I think is interesting about Ross's contribution to this conversation is that there's an acronym that we haven't heard yet today, I think, and that's NNSA, which is the National Nuclear Security Administration. Now, many of the folks from energy communities here that are working with the defense applications, you're familiar with NNSA within DOE. But for some of the communities that are new to nuclear, NNSA is looking at some of those issues around nonproliferation and international collaboration. And with Ross's background as a former energy attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, we'll get a little bit more of that international perspective. And that's important, I think, in ways that we can overlook when we think about new nuclear deployment in the United States, because we're so focused on how do we do this at the community level, we might not be thinking about how important the international market is for the companies that are looking to really scale their product and sell not only in the United States, but internationally as well, because there's a large market. And, the United States has the largest amount of nuclear. We have over 750 terawatt hours of nuclear in the United States. We have the largest fleet with more than 90, almost 100 plants operating in the United States. The next competitor there is China. They have half as much energy being produced by nuclear and about half as many plants. So that's changing. They've got many more plants under construction in China than we do. But I think the long operating history in the United States is something that's really attractive to the international market, and that's why we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow, but we'll get a preview of that from our speakers here today. And then finally, we have Seth Kirschenberg from Energy Communities Alliance, but he is also a lawyer. And so that long history of work, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say it that way. So this is what happens when we introduce people we know.
She says that with praise.
It was praise, yes. No, but I think the work that the legal work that goes into the public-private partnerships that make nuclear happen and any kind of infrastructure happen is a really important aspect and a detail that we need to think about, because really to make these deployments real, we're talking about transactions. And what do those look like? Because many of you will be in the process of helping to define what those things are. So that was my very long introduction to this session and our great panelists. I'm really excited to have this conversation. But I want to give you, Steve, first an opportunity to kind of introduce your perspective on the nuclear ecosystem, why it's important, what you think needs to happen in this arena.
Sure, and thank you to the ECA for having me. I think this is my third year in a row here, and just appreciate the opportunity. So I'm at the Energy Futures Initiative. That is a think tank based in DC, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how do you make first-of-a-kind technologies, nth-of-a-kind industries. And we've taken some of that thinking, and we've teamed up with NTI from Ross and his group, and the Clean Air Task Force to create a collaboration of think tanks called the Nuclear Scaling Initiative. And what are we trying to do? Well, if you think that nuclear has a significant role in the future, then how do you get there? I'll take you back to December of 2023, Dubai, COP28. 22 countries basically said that we are pledging to triple nuclear capacity around the world. 6 other countries have joined that as well, multiple communities, multiple industrials. But what does that actually mean? That is a 1 terawatt to 1.2 terawatts of new capacity to be built in the next 20 years. That is a $6 to $10 trillion opportunity globally. In the US, it's probably anywhere from 10 to 20% of that. And if that's the end state, how do we get there? Because that turns out to be about 50 gigawatts of building new capacity around the world every year for 20 years. 1983, I don't know what you were doing, but I was small, and probably half the room was not even alive. 1983 was the last time, or was when we, as a global community, achieved peak capacity build-out, 30 gigawatts. That's the most we've ever done in 1 year in the history of humankind. Now we're trying to do 50 every year for 20 years. That's a 50% increase on the rate. How are you going to do that? Well, that's going to take a lot of cash. That's going to take selection of specific technologies. That's going to take a lot of thinking about what are you going to do with the spent nuclear fuel. To Jeremy's point, where are you going to get the most valuable resource, which is the people? How are you going to scale up a supply chain? We've been spending a lot of time in Central and Eastern Europe and the US, and the way that we think about how you start moving forward as an industry is 3 things. 1, aggregating demand. You need a lot of demand to back what? Order books. One reason why Vogtle cost so much is we didn't really know what we were doing. It's the first time that we built any new nuclear in this country in 30 years. And now we've built 2, they're running, it's awesome. They were 2 times over cost, and now all that skill and all that capability is starting to melt. We need to keep the industry going, and the only way you keep the industry going is if you build a lot of stuff, and you have certainty that there's gonna be a lot of stuff to be built. But how do you get there? Because no one wants to take first-of-a-kind risk, right? Everyone wants to go to heaven, no one wants to die. So the idea here is, how do you share risk, right? You need a community, you need a utility, you need an OEM, you need an EPC, you need private equity, you need hyperscalers. They all have a role in sharing risk. But even if you have all this private capital that is trying to share risk, no one wants to move forward. And we see that. Why? Because no one believes we can actually build these things on time and on budget. So what we advocate for are targeted, limited, federal subsidies and support mechanisms to help take that pinhole risk off the table. There needs to be a big brother or big sister balance sheet behind the first few of a kind to get that order book going, to build the market confidence so you have the data so that we no longer need federal subsidy and support to get this going. And if subsidy sounds weird or bad to you, let me tell you this. We did it before, and there is no nation in the world that doesn't use some government support to get nuclear going. As Laura mentioned, China is catching up. If you think about all the nuclear construction in the world today, 87% of it is either Russian or China. From an American perspective, we like to play in that game, but no one really wants to, we don't have the capability to stand behind that just yet. So this is not just a domestic issue, this is an international and competitive issue, and all of these can come together with demand aggregation, order book formation, and risk sharing to get this all kickstarted. Alan, over to you.
All right. Just dive right into it. Okay. Yeah, so again, my name is Alan On, Deputy Director for Nuclear for the Climate and Energy Program at Third Way. I lead the organization's day-to-day work on nuclear energy policy issues. Third Way is a federal policy think tank that champions modern center-left ideas and policies. I ripped that off straight from the website. Y'all can check out thirdway.org if you really want to confirm that. Third Way has been around for about 20 years, founded in 2005, has a range of programs across a number of different policy issue areas, from national security to healthcare to education. I'm a part of the Climate and Energy Program, which is the largest program at Third Way at present. We just celebrated our 15th year anniversary last year. Broadly, the goal of the Climate and Energy Program or team is to leverage American innovation in clean energy technologies like nuclear, the work done at U.S. national laboratories like INL, and translate that to deployment, to commercialization. So as Laura referred to, some or many of you might be familiar with some of the work that Third Way has done specifically on nuclear. Famously, we put advanced nuclear, quote unquote, on the map, quite literally mapped out the locations of companies and developers across the United States, North America, that were working on commercializing advanced reactor technologies. And as Laura alluded to, started that effort roughly around 10, 12 years ago. As far as Third Way's role and significance in the space, in this ecosystem, I'll say two things, and I personally can't take credit for any of this because I just started the organization in 2021. But first, it's to have been this pioneer in creating awareness amongst policymakers, the Washington policy community, around the emergence of private sector efforts to commercialize advanced reactor technologies and make them real. Second, it's been this, to be the central figure in catalyzing bipartisan support for nuclear energy, which we have enjoyed in the United States for the better part of this past decade. Historically, as many of you know, that has not always been the case. It's been a partisan issue in terms of Republicans tending to be in favor, Democrats tending to be opposed. And so, it's been Third Way's work in engaging primarily with moderate Democrats on doing the analysis on why nuclear deployment is so important to reach our clean energy goals, our climate goals, and that work obviously has helped in crossing that bridge. And we've seen the results of that work over the last several years in terms of the landmark legislation that we've seen out of Congress, NECA, NEMA, Energy Act of 2020, which contain authorizations for the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Program, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Nuclear Fuel Security Act, and most recently the ADVANCE Act, which all passed Congress with fairly broad or even wide margins. And so, for this group, for this audience, what's the relevance for communities? I think I could say that communities are very much at the tip of the spear of everything we do at the federal level. Federal tax credits, federal support for advanced reactor demonstrations, at the end of the day, support the aspirations and the ambitions of local communities in terms of job creation, economic development, clean air, public health. At a more practical level, I'd say the remaining pockets of opposition to nuclear, quote unquote, educational gaps, if you will, tend to be concentrated in the more progressive parts of the Democratic Party. And so I think Third Way is, proud to be that voice on the left, albeit center left, being that standard bearer for nuclear, articulating the importance of nuclear deployment for the national interest. And so I think we are happy to be a resource for you all, as you all are having these conversations, these debates with stakeholders in your parts of the world, in your parts of the country. And so please feel free to reach out if we can be of any assistance or be a resource on so many of these issues. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Ross.
Well, thanks, and big thanks to ECA and all the sponsors for having me here today. It's my first time back in Idaho Falls in about 8 years, I think, so great to be back. Lots of growth, I see, which is nice to see. Steve did a great job of kind of introducing the Nuclear Scaling Initiative, which I am a part of. My organization, NTI, is a part of. So I won't rehash all that, but maybe just give a little bit of background into kind of my part in all this, and maybe I'll start with an admission. I hope it doesn't get me booed out of the room, but I'm not really a nuclearist, and I say that in that, like, I am really interested in robust energy solutions for communities. I'm interested in economic solutions for communities. I think that nuclear energy absolutely has a really important role to play in that. But I also think that it's really important that we get nuclear energy right. And in my personal experience, I've seen it go both ways, and that's kind of the perspective that I bring. I grew up in Michigan, the other side of the state from Palisades, but not too far from Fermi too. And it was a great introduction to nuclear power for me, right? I mean, here is a power station that's providing good jobs for the community. It is very clearly a clean energy source. And it's also a workhorse, right? A real 24/7 baseload for electricity. And so that was kind of my introduction to what nuclear energy is. And I set off with that as my foundation. And kind of years later, as Laura mentioned, I was working as a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. And Japan, phenomenal country, some of the best energy mines in the world they have over there. But as we know, they have a mixed history with nuclear energy, right? And we all know about Fukushima. I won't rehash that here, but I worked an awful lot with a community up in northern Japan that had been sold this idea back in, I think it was 1991, that reprocessing used nuclear fuel, recycling was the way to go. and that this is going to solve the country's waste problems. This is going to bring economic prosperity to the country and the region. The plant was supposed to come online in 1997. We're still waiting for the full commercial startup of that plant. It is not exactly going the way that it was expected to go. And so, you know, I have that as part of my perspective too, and understanding that nuclear energy can be this really great force for good in the community, but it can also be lofty expectations that don't come true, and it's unfortunate, but that is the history that we're dealing with. But this is also why I am so excited to be a part of the Nuclear Scaling Initiative, because what we are doing is working to scale nuclear energy up in the right way. And so really realizing the promise and unlocking, you know, what we think of as responsible and sustainable nuclear energy. Steve talked a little bit about kind of some of the strategies we have for this. Another thing that I'm working on quite a bit is the issue of technology selection, and you know, recognizing that we have some amazing companies working on fantastic technology here in the United States, around the world as well. But there's dozens and dozens and dozens, and how do communities, right, really pick the technologies that are right for them? And it can seem really exciting, it is really exciting, but at the same time recognizing that the decisions that are made on technology today, these are not 5, 10-year decisions. This is probably a 100-year relationship that we're getting into, right, from start of the project to end of decommissioning. And I just really want to make sure that this is a positive relationship, something that's really going to enrich the community, and not that albatross that hangs over multi-generations. So finally, I'll just highlight that Nuclear Scaling Initiative, NTI, we are independent, non-profit organizations, not up here selling anything. You know, we win when you as communities win, and so really look forward to this dialogue and hopefully talking to many more of you across the next couple days.
Great, thanks. You know, it's interesting, if we could pull up the slide. When I look at these projects, I look at it from the lens of someone who actually does actual transactions on a regular basis. I'll do over $1 billion in energy transactions. This quarter, I'll probably do about $150 million for battery and solar projects. We're doing a large steel plant who's doing a battery and solar project right now. And we actually close on the equity and debt side of it. I typically represent the investor or the financer on those types of projects, and so we're doing these regularly. So when I look at one of these projects, they're not even close to ready to being project finance ready, because we don't know what's going on as far as what the technology is, licensing. There's a lot of uncertainties. But I worked with UAMPS as special counsel. I was working on the public-private partnership. The power agreement, the PPAs portion of it. And so I had a real look into what it takes to put an agreement together with the federal government, what it takes to actually develop, you know, a project. And I worked with, you know, trying to help Los Alamos get NNSA to buy some of the power off the UAMPS project and others. You know, what was interesting is they actually did have the order book. The technology wasn't ready. The federal government stepped up over and over and over again for different types of assistance, but the technology wasn't ready to go through the licensing yet. And so it added some uncertainty. We also wrote, as a lawyer, I wrote a couple of books for the Department of Energy, Nuclear Energy Office on how to actually look at the financing and the lessons learned from financing a lot of the renewable energy projects that were successful with the, you know, and are still successful projects that are operating. So when we tried to break down what is the nuclear energy ecosystem, and we tried to highlight, and basically it's everybody in this room, we put down some of these. So when we look at these, we look at, you know, the technology developers, the end users, which are a lot of different things. The financiers, that's the part that I really focus on, and then the regulators. And we've seen, it's been interesting to see the different developers go through different methods of looking at financing their upfront costs. Some have gone to the capital markets, some have really relied on some federal pieces, and some have relied on a smaller level of equity investors as we're going forward. But they're all going to need financing as we go forward for these individual projects, and they're going to need to talk to a lot of these different people as they're going forward. We talked about this with Congressman Simpson. There are key pieces like the tax credit piece and other pieces that we need to keep in place. And everyone says, well, it's a subsidy, but every energy project in the United States has some sort of federal subsidy. In Oak Ridge, when you go there to their local museum, they actually have a chart of all the different subsidies going to oil and gas, going to renewables, going to nuclear. And so it's fascinating, but everybody gets it. And then last, the regulators, which are key. And I include local and state in there because there's a lot of permitting and other types of things that have to occur. And so I see some communities trying to get ahead, like in Oak Ridge, they talked today about how they're looking at zoning and permitting to try and help the projects now. So when they come up, the city's ready to get the city and the county are ready to get these projects going forward. But I want you all to think about and understand the focus of not just what we're looking at in today's world, but all the different things that have to go on, the different education, not just of our own communities, but all these different parties. I worked on the financing of an interim storage facility in Ukraine, believe it or not. I represented Bank of America on that transaction. We had to introduce to rating agencies what that meant, how is the project actually going to be paid off. By the way, they're still paying it off. The bondholders are still being paid. But these are tough things. You need to educate all these different people in this ecosystem in order to make sure that they understand those things. I do data centers, by the way, every quarter as well. We represent the largest data center builders out there. And what they're trying to do is get them done in the next couple of years. They are not waiting. They're trying to keep up with demand right now. So, these are projects that we need to make sure move forward. To the long term, they're going to need that energy and the communities where they're located. But then there's a lot of other uses, and we've talked about those today. So, think about all these different things as you're trying to put together your project and understand there are a lot of moving pieces in this ecosystem.
There are a lot of moving pieces, and I think what I like about your graphic, Seth, is that it is circular, so you can kind of dial into any one point of it. With so many moving pieces, I think it's easy to look and say, oh my God, the reality of these projects is too complex. This can't possibly come to fruition. And, Ross talked a little bit about the technology risk and the technology choice involved. You talked about the regulatory risk. We've talked a little bit about sort of product market fit in terms of where the end users come in order to come up with an order book, like Steve had talked about. So I guess I'd like to get each of your impression of, where to start with so many different moving pieces. Where should a community start if they're interested?
I guess
Yeah.
my initial thought is start with demand. What do you need? How much power do you need, and for what? Before you even think about nuclear, right? Is there a demand vector that makes sense? Are you trying to replace existing generation capacity? Are you trying to attract new high energy intense industry? What is the prospect for population growth? In the short term, data centers are going to be the king, right? One hyperscaler told me that they're going to build one data center every 3 days for the next 3 years. And that's just one hyperscaler, and there's 5. and that's just over the next 3 years. But the long-ish poles in the tent are other sources of demand. There's overall electrification in the economy, transportation, industry, heating and cooling are all increasing and being electrified. There's chip fabs, there's battery manufacturing. What is the industry? What is the basis for the demand? And then you can start thinking about, does nuclear make sense given your generation? But once you have an idea of the kind of demand, how big it's going to be, then you can start thinking about what is the right resource, and nuclear might be one of those. And I'll just stop there and hand it off to Alan.
I'll just add to that. I mean, you have to think about the application, the use case, right? And I think there's general versatility around so many of these SMR advanced reactor designs that could do power, heat, load follow. But I think you look at certain designs that are optimized for certain applications, certain geographies. For example, high temperature gas cooled reactors, if you need a higher temperature output for a certain industrial application, the Natrium reactor has a integrated molten salt energy storage system, and for those regions where you have a lot of intermittent generation, wind and solar. And of course, what made the Kairos design so attractive for Google was just the reliability, the online refueling, so you don't have to pause operations. You can keep operating the unit. And when you consider the standards that some of these data center operators have, like 99.999% reliability, those are sort of the traits and the characteristics that they're interested in. I'll just say there are considerations beyond the technical issues as well, right? When you think about Amazon's decision to invest in X Energy, why did they do that? Because Amazon has their data center operations concentrated in the Pacific Northwest. Energy Northwest is the only sort of utility in that region that has any sort of operating experience with nuclear energy. They've already vetted, they already had X Energy as the preferred design. And then of course, they're not the ones having to move first. Dow is already moving ahead with the Seadrift project. There's a lot of faith in Dow's ability to manage mega projects. And so all of those different considerations come into play. And yeah, I mean, I think I could go on and on, but I don't want to dominate this discussion and crowd out some other viewpoints here.
No, not at all. I mean, I concur with what both Steve and Alan said. I think also just kind of building out what is the vision for what you're trying to put together as a community. What is the infrastructure that's in place? Really kind of mapping out, right? What's needed or what's wanted, and what you already have. And so, from that, I think then you can really build out some analysis of is nuclear right for you? And if yes, then, what flavor of nuclear might be best? And so, if you have high demand for lots of electrons and you have great grid infrastructure already in place. Maybe kind of a large gigawatt scale reactor is good for you. Maybe though, you're looking for something that's more behind the meter and kind of discrete customers and maybe smaller reactors. And then you get into the different technologies. But I think first step is just kind of mapping out, what do you need? What's your vision? And what do you already have in place?
So one of the things that I've seen a couple of times is we work with DoD as well, and as they're looking at these projects, so a lot of times it could be resilience, it could be future-proofing particular projects. There are things that we may not think about that are readily apparent that they are looking at. One of the first projects I ever looked at that was that way was one of the past Clinch River site projects. TVA was looking at putting in an SMR. Sounds familiar to now, at the Clinch River site, but it was to support ORNL and their facilities and have a line that was direct, and that was that was something. So for resilience reasons, they thought that may make sense as you're going forward. When we're looking at a lot of these projects in places like the military's looking at Alaska. Or they're looking, Guam has talked about being interested in these types of things. They're, using diesel fuel number 3, I think right now, some of them for powering their facilities. So they're looking at, they need power that is available at all times. And a lot of your communities, you can look at what you're doing right now, but 24/7 reliable power is a reason why a lot of the data center parties are looking at it, and a lot of the other economic development entities are looking at this particular type of power. So it could be a host of reasons. And I do want to mention, because the other folks on this panel, they're resources that we go to all the time. They're people that can answer a lot of your questions as you're going forward and thinking about these things, because that's the critical piece, is sometimes, you need to think through, and these are people that have seen a lot and can help you through those processes.
I think, Seth, that's I think a great reminder for folks that you can visit any of the websites of the organizations that the folks here represent and find tons of reports and availability. Ross and Alan, I want to direct this next question to you because you both have a lot more international experience. And I think that, when we think about where to start with all these moving pieces and the demand signal, the resilience piece of it, I think one of the things that it's easy to overlook with nuclear is that this is a 100-year commitment. And we talk about that in the international community when nuclear countries that are new to nuclear start to look at it. We tell them to think about it as a 100-year plan. That's something that I think our communities here in the United States kind of can start to approach as well. If you think about if a data center is only good for 20 years, what do you do with that new operating asset in 30 years? And so from your perspective internationally, what other lessons do you think we can learn and kind of adapt to bring home those things, whether it's how American communities deploying first-of-a-kind technologies are setting up an export market, or financing models that we might be able to adapt at home that we haven't seen here before? How do you see that interplay between what's happening internationally and what's happening with new deployments here?
Yeah, sure, happy to. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And, funny enough, I think where my mind goes first is actually spent fuel management. And I think that there's a number of really interesting lessons, positive and negative, to learn from our colleagues around the world. I think, first, understanding that no matter what fuel cycle you choose, whether you're going for direct disposal or some sort of reprocessing scheme, there is going to be nuclear waste that needs to be disposed of. And so, I know there were some where I was in Japan and who were quite surprised in the community to understand that even though they're pursuing reprocessing, recycling, that they still need a geologic repository. And some were saying, well, why did we do this? So I found that to be quite interesting. And then where there has been some really great progress, right? Some of my colleagues in Finland, in Sweden, even just north of here in Canada, right? Where they're making some excellent progress on kind of working with communities to site a repository. Some of those cases and specific details are maybe more applicable, some not as applicable to the United States. But I think being able to look at what those who are having success in the spent fuel management space are doing, those who haven't had as much success, and it gives us some room to learn from both of those cases.
Yeah, no, I'll just echo Ross's comments around spent nuclear fuel. Obviously, the process on spent nuclear fuel management in the United States has been politically fraught, and there's been a lot of challenges. But I think we can find hope in international examples. Countries that have forged ahead with citing geological repositories and solutions to spent fuel disposal, and look to those as with some degree of optimism. I guess. the one international example, and this will dovetail Steve's earlier remarks around, building order books, getting 10th of a kind. The South Koreans have been extremely successful in standardizing around one design, just building it over and over and over again. Just for your football fans out there, the old Marshawn Lynch interview, if you recall that, just building the same design over and over and over again, and over a period of decades. I mean, they were able to essentially reduce the cost of nuclear deployment and generation and construction. So. I think, with some of the smaller reactors with the different use cases, you don't have to just do one design. You can maybe pick 2 or 3, 4, whatever it might be. I'm not being prescriptive around, how many designs that we're gonna end up building. But I think, that's an appropriate, I think, place to look at in the world as far as driving some lessons learned. So.
Can I just add?
Of course.
There really is a nexus between domestic deployment and international opportunity, right? So the international community, I would believe, is hungry for options, but they don't want to take on the technology risk. There's already enough risk building new nuclear whether you're an embarking country, you haven't done nuclear before, or you're re-embarking, you're doing it after a while, of using American technology. One reason AP1000s are actually getting a lot of traction right now is because we built them. They're operating, and they're operating really, really well. The technological case has been proven, and at least on that piece of the stack, it's already an nth of a kind. Now, can we build it better? That's still to be determined, but at least on the reactor part, a lot of that risk is being taken off the table. And now you have customers in Central and Eastern Europe and around the world. So thinking about that nexus is really, really important.
Great. No, that's, I think it is an important nexus, and I'm glad we were able to discuss it. I'm going to compress a whole bunch of our questions that we wanted to get to in the interest of time into what will probably be our last question. And really, Steve and Seth, this is really, we'll get you guys to start on this because it is about the financing piece, but more broadly, so anybody can jump in if you want. But, we talked about the potential for commercial lenders, or we intended to, the financial structures that can come into place to make these projects possible, the equity investments that are coming into some of the different companies or projects. There are lots of different ways that these projects are taking shape. And when we talk about all the moving pieces, ultimately it comes down to the nuts and bolts and who pays for them. So when we think about what progress looks like in a project that's going to take 5 to 10 years potentially, like what should community, local leaders be looking for in terms of the indicative contracts, documents? Like, how do we show progress? What should we be evaluating as progress?
It's funny. When we looked at the UAMPS project, it was, I see Philo in the front row here from Los Alamos. It was really, for them, it was building the demand first. And so they had a lot of different municipalities and focusing on that. And so right now, you might be dealing with a microreactor, which you're probably looking at one or, a smaller number of customers. You may be looking at a SMR, maybe it's a small utility, maybe it's a couple of users, or you may be looking at something else. But I think, when I break it down, I think of Philo, who's a utility director, and if he's going to invest in something, he needs to make sure that there's going to be an off-taker for the power, whether it's his own community or whether it's Los Alamos National Laboratory, or whether it's communities surrounding that are actually going to buy into it as well. And so when I look at all these different projects, I focus first on who the customer is. And then, the other thing is what kind of support that they can get. There's a lot of different financing tools that are used throughout 1,000 different types of projects that can be used on these as they're going forward. But since we only have a little bit of time, I'm going to hand it over to Steve to finish with his last 45 seconds.
there are a lot of tools out there, but I think we need to be sober in what are the risks that remain and who's going to bear those. I would say that the existing federal tools are good, and they should be kept, but they're insufficient. I think there are opportunities for, especially with this administration, that if you brought a specific deal to the table, I think they would be very open to making it work. And so getting to specificity, I think the last panel actually said it well, getting to this is what we have come up with. We will do X if you bring Y. I think that level of specificity has not really been there in the industry. If we're able to get to there, I think you'll have the other side of the table coming forward with enthusiasm.
Great.
I just want to add one thing on that. Just because, so when we look at the projects that have been announced to restart 3 Mile Island or the Whole Tech project where they already have the customers in place, those are more likely to get some sort of financing because they're real projects. They're not just announcements. And so it depends on how solid the power purchase agreements are. When we were looking at the UAMPS projects and other types of things, we look at like WAPA, who has a 30-year authority to assist federal agencies to buy the power up front. And so it's getting those folks to do that who can then allow you to then have an order book and to get at least that first project and hopefully some of those nth projects developed as you're going forward.
Just really quickly, it's not in the nuclear space, but if you want a case study that is state-driven on how you might actually share risk with various parties, I recommend our friends in Nevada, NV Energy, Fervo, geothermal, and Google. What they did with respect to a tariff structure there is really, really interesting. There's a lot of protection for all the players involved, whether the technology works or not. And I think there's a lot of learning from that structure that can be ported into the nuclear space.
That's a great example to end on. Thank you, Steve. And thank our panelists for all of the work that they're doing on an ongoing basis and for our discussion today. And we'll wrap this up and invite you to applaud this team. And we are going to start to move our innovators back for the next round. Thank you. So as we move into the next showcase of companies, we'll bring them back up on the stage. And we're going to switch here quickly to, I think, what is our final session of the day.